Like Mine Sky, The Life of a Progressive Rock Musician, Chapter 2 and 3. I didn't know if I'd ever marry her. I don't think she'd want to, and we never discussed it. Once in a while, I'd stay overnight at her student apartment in the university town where she lived during the week. Though on certain weekends, she'd make an excuse that she'd need to stay to do some research at the school's library and not visit her parents in our small town. We spent a lot of time listening to records, drinking cheap wine, and lying in bed together, but we never had consummated the affair. She was saving herself, I suppose. Oh, who cares? I wasn't heartbroken during our stagnant relationship, which seemed ultimately to be going nowhere, and she had a rather princess-like ego, which made it difficult to get really close to her emotionally. There were plenty of other girls, and life was opening up for me and others, with an increasingly liberal sexual attitude in England. Hey, I was a singer in a pretty good band, and not exactly mobbed by female fans, but we were well known and popular. I went home from our little lunch date feeling unsatisfied, sort of down. It was just not happening in the long term with Olga. Anyway, I just knew she was dating some other guy. I felt it in my bones. I lay on my bed after taking a few puffs of a freshly rolled marijuana cigarette and blowing the smoke out the window, then lighting incense to cover up any smell. My parents had to know I smoked pot, but I don't think they really cared as long as I did it discreetly. They'd turn a blind eye. Needing a break from rock and roll, I put on an album of classical music, Vaughan Williams, a bucolic trip in a sylvan landscape. It was here that I could dwell and hearken back to a quieter time. And I often felt that this type of music could be incorporated into our band's music somehow. Could one of us play violin? Could we hire some violinists and cellists to sit in at one of our concerts? Would that be possible? Oh, well, I drifted back to that Dorset hillside where I'd woken up last week, and I saw a little sprite and some gnomes and leprechauns and fantasy animals like rabbits with hats and dogs in tuxedos, and Shakespeare saluting me, a tankard of ale held high in hand. And there were famous actresses dancing, and camels and white horses galloping beneath multicolored kites flying high in the wind. The next weekend, our band played at a pub on the outskirts of town, sort of a tourist place on the edge of the forest not far from castle ruins. They'd actually recreated the moat at the castle and filled it up with water, so it made a great photograph and postcard. There's a lot of foreigners and other tourists there, so it was a sometimes really appreciative audience. We pounded in on our first number, which sounded somewhat like The Who, with Mike soaring on vocals and me joining for the hook. Then our organist, John, fired off a solo, which seemed to impress the beer-soaked crowd, as many of them stopped talking and looked over at his fingers as they flew across the keyboard. And John looked good in Chelsea boots and black leather jacket. I tacked on a nice lead with lots of reverb, rippling off the twang of my guitar. All in all, it was pretty good, this song of ours, and we got more than a few clapping hands at the end. Usually, there were a few whistles and hoots, whilst conversations resumed into the din and the hum. The pub owner had loaded our equipment in the van to transport us back to Thomas's parents' home. He said, well, hey, let's go on to a party at Wrigley. And we detoured down the country lane past the city limits to a deep forest, flashing lit deer and other critter eyes lighting the way. We knew Wrigley. It was the mansion of Reginald Brixton, the CEO of a UK fast food chain. Couldn't believe we'd ever be going there, but the pub's owner's sister was Brixton's new girlfriend. He'd come into the pub a few months ago on one of his notorious sprees and chatted up Elsie, and she was game, and so was he, and hence the first invitation to the old manor for dinner, from which the guests were later dismissed, so he could hone in on Elsie. Thus a relationship was sealed that romantic stormy night, and they'd been on an item on the scene for several weeks, whizzing through towns in his triumph. Galloping horses near the castle, shopping and buying lots of fine provisions at local markets, hanging at local restaurants and bars, and just having a lot of fun. The paparazzi made it down from London to spy on the couple, and pretty soon there were photo spreads in major English rags. Even the BBC did a short spot on the goings-on. Even so, quickly superseded by other bigwigs' doings and scandals. News was fast and furious, and the public's attention spans were quickly diverted. Then the van pulled up in the pebbled drive of an 18th century manor. Dimly lit half-timbers, bricks, and casement windows welcomed the group. A butler opened the heavy wooden door to an antechamber of splendor. Antique clocks, sofas, armchairs, paintings filled the room. Brixton appeared with a martini glass high in hand. Elsie was draped around his other arm. "Well, bloody hell, come on up. The party's in full swing," the fast food magnate exclaimed. We went upstairs, greeted by a semi-nude teeny bopper painted in shocking psychedelic colors and a fat dog barking incessantly. The other guests were laughing and careening into view, chatting up a storm, variously attired from tuxedos to gym clothing, the full gamut as modern jazz whizzed and swirled between the legs, arms, and glasses of booze. I couldn't get the little chunky beagle off my shins, and a gaudy older woman was breathing into my ear, the smell of vodka martini nearly anesthetizing me. The naked girl's breast bobbed around as she circle danced amongst the inebriated groups of partiers. Wow, what a party. God, I thought. Mike, Thomas, and John were soon chatting up chicks and snorting and toking weed, coke, and dipping into the bowl full of colorful pills being passed around. I even thought I spotted my girlfriend Olga, but it could have just been some resemblance. I didn't know. "And what do you do?" asked the 50-ish woman. Her eyes were watery, her eyelashes thick and dark. "I'm a guitar player. I'm in a band," I replied. She chuckled and walked away towards the butler, who was holding a tray of hors d'oeuvres, which she picked and gobbled up like a crazed turkey. There was one painting in a niche of the dark wood-paneled wall that freaked me out. It was a young duchess or an 18th century aristocrat's daughter or something, or some high-class girl. It seemed like she was gazing ardently at me and smiling, then quickly frowning, and her eyes turned mean all of a sudden. Yes, I'd taken a hit off a joint, but I don't hallucinate so readily off THC. Who put LSD in my beer? I found myself with a small glass of golden liquid. It tasted and smelt like beer. A hoppy relaxation followed after the sips, and perhaps someone had laced the suds with THC. I couldn't believe it when what seemed to be a barrister or some big businessman, some important man, began doing handstands and tumbles on the bearskin rug. Then he'd dance around to the rhythms pulsing from the hi-fi system. Chortles, grunts, giggles, a rollicking mess of chaos erupted from the party, and I felt that these people were nuts, just crazy. I spoke with one woman who was an assistant manager at Lloyd's of London. She was genteel and posh, reserved yet polite and calming, as I thought this festive gathering was just way too much for me to handle. It was too weird. She brought me down to earth with business talk and how Lloyd's was expanding, adding new departments and goods. Also, she spoke of her travels to far-off places like India and Hawaii. Ah, well, she could be my mother's bridge partner or fellow congregant at the town church. She seemed really out of place. Oddly, she'd come up with some guy that looked like a guru of some sort, who presently was seated with a young woman on his lap and was caressing his reddish beard and giggling, enunciating his words with weird accents like the Maharishi. He uttered trite spiritual axioms and maxims, whilst his audience, bobbing and weaving under the influence of consciousness-altering substances, listened, some with rapt attention, others semi-there, most just out of their minds. A rather bemused and frisk Irish setter wandered around the party and gobbled up bits of food the revelers dropped, and jumped up to greet and thank people, paws on chests. Mike, our bassist and singer, was lying on a rug, whilst a pair of girls dropped cheese balls into his mouth. Every time one landed correctly, which wasn't often, as he was surrounded by snacks that missed the target, a girl would pour a sip of wine on his waiting tongue. Thomas, our drummer, was in an argument with some type of professor about an imminent ecological disaster that would wipe out a third of the world's population. Bullshit, Thomas reasoned. He'd merely laughed at each portent of doom. Some chap brought out a guitar and started strumming Beatles tunes, and he could hardly be heard above the stereo or guests. Yet he continued playing and humming the melodies, and then there was some type of impromptu flautist scurrying about trying to fit into the scene with discordant motifs. At this point, I was getting dizzy and felt the need to sit down. There was only the edge of an antique wooden bench available up against the wall.